Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. Welcome to today's episode of the Capstone Conversation. Today, I am joined by Roxana Bekemohammadi, who is with the United States Hydrogen Alliance. We're going to talk about how hydrogen impacts the economy here in the East Bay, how it's impacting California, and what are some of the goals, and what does the national picture look like? So thank you for joining me, Roxana.
Thanks, Jared, for having me.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what got you to discover this alliance and bring everybody in the industry together.
Absolutely. My dream since I was 15, I grew up in Los Angeles, was to go and work for the Air Resources Board in Sacramento. And I did that 10 years later. I've always been at the intersection of technology commercialization and policymaking. I happened to get into hydrogen as an accident. I ended up attending UC Irvine's National Fuel Cell Research Center for graduate school and understood the benefits of hydrogen and fuel cells at that point, and that was in 2010. And once I graduated, I went straight to my dream job, the California Air Resources Board. I was working on zero emission vehicle regulations, specifically on light duty vehicles initially, and then into the heavy duty sector, trucks, buses. And at that time, we were evaluating how hydrogen could be incorporated in heavier applications. Once I left government, I was interested in deploying more technology on the ground. I learned a lot from that. And eventually I got into lobbying. I ended up starting my own hydrogen lobbying firm in California in 2018. And from there in 2020, we ended up starting what was the Western States Hydrogen Alliance. And we really wanted to take lessons learned from California and take them eastward into the Western states and ensure that the deployment of hydrogen in those other states would be as successful, or if not a lot more successful. And once the bipartisan infrastructure law was signed, we went national. So that was the first week of December in 2021. Since then, we've been working on getting hydrogen policies enacted across the US. We have 18 laws enacted to date from the work that we've been doing. And we continue to educate policymakers across the US to understand how hydrogen can be deployed successfully in their communities. It all kind of started in California, being ground zero for hydrogen deployment in the US. Other states have seen some activities, but California has had the most consistent investment and deployment of hydrogen technologies. The California Air Resources Board has been heavily focused on since 1999 when they thought that fuel cell electric vehicles would help them implement their zero emission vehicle mandate.
Your office is here in the East Bay too for you and your team. You live here. So this really is an East Bay bred organization with a national reach in the space. I loved how you talked about at 15, you wanted to work for the Air Resource Board. Uh, I can't imagine there's a lot of 15-year-olds with that dream. So that's pretty cool and has led you to be a success. What advice would you have for other young women who are interested in hydrogen, energy, air quality, better for the environment?
I think one of the most difficult things when you're young is you're optimistic, enthusiastic, and you're still naive. And people take that combination and they can kind of use it against you. So, what do you do with someone who has a lot of passion, who feels invigorated to change the world? I've seen both. I've seen it be handled in multiple ways, but really the most predominant ones is one, which is kind of like know your place and, we'll like almost, it's sort of a dismissive attitude toward that optimism. And then I've seen others who have realized that it's worthwhile to cultivate that passion. That even occurred when I was in high school and I was trying to volunteer with environmental groups. I felt really discouraged with that particular group. And there was this group called Generation Earth run by tree people. They took young students and provided opportunities for them to learn about environmental stewardship, also cultivate their speaking skills. And that was so transformational for me It was exactly what I needed. It helped me start my recycling program. I have to say, it's my early days of what I do exactly now. I think it's really important for the youth to find programs that are going to encourage them and take their innate gifts and do something with it. Really encourage them to not just be stewards of the environment, but stewards for humanity. It's important to empower the youth. I started my own fellowship program because of that. I actually hire from my own fellowship program. I call it an apprenticeship. And I think the folks that come through my shop are learning how to wear a lot of different hats and be entrepreneurial and scrappy and resourceful and yeah, have a little bit of that sass and that and find that confidence. And, I provide that safety net for them. They're still being constantly challenged to go beyond their role. I don't care how old they are. I don't care what their background is. I think a lot of people have the potential capacity to do amazing things. I think it's important for the youth to find that. I also think that it's important for adults to actually be reinvigorated with that passion. I think that life beats us down. I think things are very challenging, especially in the US, in the post COVID world. I think it's fair to say that the significant polarization of our political system creates significant whiplash that's really difficult for people. And I think that this is an opportunity for folks to benefit both ways those that are learning and those that have learned and can mentor.
I have 3 daughters, and I talk about how to teach women, particularly about science and our community and math and all of that, and just expose them to it. Great that you got those mentorships and everything else. Give us a picture before we talk specifically about California. Where in general is the hydrogen industry going? What are the benefits of hydrogen? Where are you seeing the most growth? Let's start with that big picture.
I always believe in duality. There's so much opportunity for hydrogen to play a role in decarbonizing so many different sectors that the disadvantage to that is that it almost makes it hard to focus on a particular sector. Historically, we've seen great investment in hydrogen in aerospace applications. And a lot of people are familiar with electricity and batteries. It's not novel. We take it for granted and we have a special relationship with it. And that means that we also make special exceptions for it. And that means that it also is easier to adopt into our policy. Hydrogen has always existed in our lives, but in a more commercial and in the back room kind of perspective or manner. It's hydrogen that took us to the moon. We have fuel cells on our spaceships. It's what's providing propulsion power. You also have water production from it. Hydrogen is also how we desulfurize our crude oil. It's the main component outside of nitrogen in nitrogen fertilizer. It's how we feed 80% of the world. It's reaction on the sun that, that provides us light. Hydrogen is what the universe is mostly comprised of. 90% of the universe is comprised of hydrogen. We have such an intimate relationship with hydrogen, but we're so unaware of it. It's been really difficult for hydrogen to gain a foothold in non-industrial or more retail settings. Hydrogen has been pretty prolific on the stationary power side, on the distributed generation power side. It can be used for centralized power production. It has definitely been important in California's air quality goals with respect to mobility applications. We have successfully deployed light duty passenger vehicles, fuel cell buses. I mean, the first fuel cell bus was operating in Thousand Palms at Sunline Transit in the 1990s. We're not new to this game. We now have maritime solutions, ferries that are operating off in the port of San Francisco right here. I mean, WIDA's operating them for BART. There's a lot of applications for hydrogen in the mobility sector. It's really one of the main ways, if not the only way, to decarbonize, especially the heavy duty sector. This is the way we're going to see trains and boats go to zero. Ultimately, aviation, I think that is still being considered in the sense that, it might be sustainable aviation fuels as a drop-in fuel, or it could be hydrogen aviation. There are companies that are deploying those technologies now, and there's companies that are investing, like major companies, major airlines that have been investing in them. I think what makes it complicated with hydrogen is that We can help decarbonize steel, cement, the chemical industry, the natural gas infrastructure system. We can provide long term seasonal energy storage. We can help with the curtailment of renewables. It's an amazing tool that can be leveraged in different ways. The way I like to advocate for it, we use electrons, they're quite important, but hydrogen is really the partner to the electron. It has a very explicit relationship with it. When we release an electron from hydrogen when we're splitting it, that's to produce electricity. I would see it as, if we've got any quantum physics enthusiasts, hydrogen is like the wave function and the electron is the particle, or vice versa. No, it depends. They have a very highly complementary relationship, even the way batteries operate. It's batteries and fuel cells are both electrochemical devices. Sometimes those technologies are pitted against each other, but they're highly complementary. Hydrogen is the way to really help us realistically overcome our dependence on fossil hydrocarbons. That's the reality of it.
A lot to unpack in all of that, and that was really good to understand the history and where we're going. Let's talk about the transit sector, which is one of the many sectors you had talked about. California has a lot of goals around zero emissions vehicles, particularly public transit fleets. There's the big belief, you said the ferries are looking at this, right? That a lot of the bus routes need hydrogen versus electric buses. Talk about the advantages of that, maybe a use case, and how realistic is that we can have hydrogen buses in a lot of places in the near term.
If you're listening and you're on the East Bay or even other parts of California, you can easily jump onto an AC Transit fuel cell bus. They operate all of the time. If you pay attention to the top or the side, it will say fuel cell or say battery electric. Sometimes it'll say diesel hybrid. AC Transit has been an amazing leader in the transit sector in California, but also nationally and globally. They have an amazing study where they compared 5 different vehicle platforms on the same kinds of routes. It's well understood that in general, you get a comparable one-to-one replacement with hydrogen fuel cells compared to your CNG or diesel bus. That's not always the case with battery. Sometimes you are looking at a 2-to-1 replacement. That's more costly. It's a question of where you're going to store all the vehicles. You need to double the depot sizes. You have not a lot of real estate in the Bay Area to take advantage of. And AC Transit has a really large fleet, and they have a number of depots. It's been a reliable technology that they've been strong advocates for. We just taken on a fuel cell ferry, commercially bought it, and is operating right now. You can get on it in the Embarcadero. Northern California has an interesting relationship with zero emission buses, especially fuel cell buses, because of the California Air Resources Board's transit regulation in the early 2000s. The transit agencies in Northern California came together and experimented with these buses, and AC Transit took the lead on it, which is why, they're in the position they're in right now. But get on the buses. They operate beautifully. They're quiet. I feel like they're perfect part of our ecosystem in the Bay Area, where we care about our environmental quality and environmental justice. We care about who's breathing in those emissions compared to diesel emissions from the buses that operate in the Bay Area. It's a huge plus. These are buses that go by schools, courts, and their homes all the time. I highly encourage anyone to get on those buses. We have a really good track record of deploying these technologies when you don't hear about it, but it's been operating here.
That's great. California, a leader in this. You just talked about the Air Resource Board putting in requirements around zero emissions fleets. And what are some of the policy goals that California has in the hydrogen space? And what should we be aware of?
California is really consistent about cutting emissions. California, the Air Resources Board has been their philosophy has not just been focused on cutting emissions, but also advocating for policies that will allow zero emission technologies to take hold. And that really became something that they understood in the late 80s when they were mapping out the emissions for the number of vehicles that would come into the state and vehicle miles traveled increasing over time because the population's also increasing. And they understood that zero emission technology was their job is to make sure that they provide clean and healthy air to Californians. And essentially, they meet the national ambient air quality standards. There are plenty of different kinds of policies and incentives that have been established for some time. Ones that we pay into our registration fees when we, register our cars. There was a huge investment by the Biden administration into hydrogen as well. California won a very competitive grant for up to $1.2 billion. And that certainly has helped more interest and more policies around hydrogen in California, even though it was already a very robust environment, but then more so to help support this investment. We're looking at roughly $3 billion coming back into the state in investments as a result of this federal expenditure. We're looking at over 200,000 jobs being created. It's beautiful to see all of that. I think where California policy goes at this exact moment in time might be a little reactionary to what's going on in the federal environment. And we have yet to see, as of today, all federal funds being dispersed have been paused. And we'll have to see. But I think that the private sector has really invested heavily in California. They're bringing a lot of revenue into the state. The reality is, all of any emerging technology, but definitely hydrogen technology, it's not cheap. The sales tax revenue that comes into the state from that equipment is beautiful. And the number of jobs that get created, I have no shortage of people coming to me wanting to develop projects in California. There is much for the state to leverage and capitalize on. I think the big question really comes down, at least with California policy, the age old question: how much does business matter to us? And I know how much we love to tout that we have the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, but there has been a mass exodus of people, a decent exodus of companies. We have to be a little bit, cognizant of that to be a little kind to the companies that are coming in, also trying to achieve our greater climate goals. And hydrogen is serving California's climate goals.
Let's hit on that 1.3 billion coming from the feds, and you threw out some other numbers, 3 billion in additional capital investment and a number of jobs. What is that for and what's happening with that?
It came from the bipartisan infrastructure law. There was $9.5 billion allotted to hydrogen. 8 billion of those dollars was put toward hydrogen, what they call hydrogen hubs. I call them hydrogen ecosystems. Basically, the best way of looking at this to really understand this is one of those things where the strengths of hydrogen are the disadvantages for battery electric and vice versa. It's not that hard to put a charger near your grocery store or in a parking lot. It's not that expensive, and it's not a heavy load on the grid either. You start adding a number of chargers, you start adding a number of fast chargers, you start adding heavy duty equipment that needs to be charged. That load and that cost looks very different. That's where hydrogen thrives. If we want to put a single station in, it is much more expensive than a charging infrastructure. But that charging infrastructure, that one charger is serving about maybe 5 cars a day, if we're lucky, versus a hydrogen station can service up to 300. What we see is that does well at scale because it's so expensive. It's better serving more things, like more demand. It does really well with large demand. You want to put hydrogen into a port, way more cost effective than putting in charging infrastructure. If you want to serve greater demands, you certainly can. That's why we see more centralized hydrogen production. What the hydrogen hubs do is they create these big centralized systems, and they create both the supply and the demand. They do hydrogen at scale where it is more cost effective, where it makes more sense, where it's going to serve a lot of end users in that manner. That's why the hydrogen hubs were created, in a sense, was to do hydrogen really at scale. There was a huge competitive process. There were a number of states that got funded through this, but California is the only hydrogen hub that is well, actually, Texas is another one. Texas and California are the only 2 states that have a hub all to themselves. There are other hubs that are a cluster of states that are adjacent, essentially.
Where is this hub in California going?
It's all of California. There's so many parties involved, the government's involved, the UC system's involved. There is no shortage of partners involved in California to get this job done. I mean, it's really over 400 partners. It makes sense for a really mature ecosystem that we have here.
Let's talk about careers in hydrogen. Talked about growing industry, growing fuel stations and potential. What are some careers that people could look for in hydrogen? And are these jobs local or throughout California?
There are a number of jobs that are important for hydrogen. There's not enough people in this industry. We're always looking for trained individuals. Now, what's amazing about hydrogen is that we need a full spectrum of skills. We need folks on the technical side. We love trained, skilled union labor. We want skilled workers working on our equipment. Hydrogen is safe. We've had safety standards for so long. NASA's playing with this all day long. The oil industry is playing with this all the time. It's what they have in their refineries. We don't really have hydrogen incidents, but it's important to maintain that by having skilled labor. We also, not only are we looking for a technical workforce, we're also looking for those in STEM. I think in general, we understand. I have a chemical engineering background. I know that just we need more folks to go into STEM. We like to encourage that. I think the country needs more folks going into STEM. There's really, I think that benefits everyone. Really, what's interesting about hydrogen is that it requires multiple disciplines. A fuel cell system or a battery system is, requires mechanical engineering, material science engineering, chemical engineering, electrical engineering. It's really multifaceted and awesome in that respect. We need everyone under the technical umbrella, be it, if you have a 4-year degree or not, to be involved. And really what's important is we also have people that are local to projects that are being deployed to make sure that they're maintaining the systems and that they're highly functional and reliable. Nobody wants a multi-million dollar mission savings project to be down. But that happens a lot because there's not enough of the technical workforce. And then on top of that, we need all of the other skills necessary for deploying anything new. We need folks that are great at marketing. We need folks in government relations. We need folks to better teach these topic areas. We really need community college professors to come up to speed on these technologies, to disseminate this to their students. We need the 4 years to also be there, the technical schools. That one super small segment, but I do think that there are a number of different jobs created in the deployment of this technology. These are chemical plants. When you think of chemical plants, when you think of refine, there are a lot of people that work there. And that's the kind of magnitude I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sometimes with some clean energy projects, it doesn't create as many jobs as you would think for the cost of the equipment. But for us, these are chemical processes. You're going to need people.
Let's help picture it. You've got a number of transit agencies throughout the East Bay. I know you talked about AC Transit. There's a big push for the trucking industry to move more towards hydrogen, light duty vehicles you mentioned earlier for city public works departments. But one city's not going to build out a hydrogen fuel station. And we're not going to necessarily see all of these locally in places.
We have it.
Okay.
Well, if you go to the Port of Oakland, you have both light duty and heavy duty fueling there. You go to Lake Merritt, different places in the East Bay, you have hydrogen refueling stations. And we go to San Francisco, we got refueling stations there. You could go to even AC Transit's Emeryville depot and fuel your light duty vehicle there. We actually need more coverage. Cities can invest in this infrastructure to meet their demands, but also the local community demands. It's going to be so critical to put hydrogen along the highways, specifically our trucking corridors for long haul trucks. I think and we might not even notice that because they're literally at our are retail gas stations a lot of the times.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Would some of the transit agencies build out their own like AC Transit does, or would they rely on a regional one?
That's a great question. First off, most of them are always going to have on-site fueling for themselves. That is behind the gate. A transit should not run out of fuel. That doesn't work well. They're always going to have it probably at their depot. And honestly, it's just like if they put in a CNG pump. It was interesting for that project in Emeryville with AC Transit that they actually added the public facing fueling station. That was cool. They put the station right outside the gate because they were already producing hydrogen. It was part of their ecosystem essentially. But if you have a captive fleet, I'm gonna recommend most likely that you have your own station or you could couple it as a public-private station to create more revenue. It can be a revenue generator for a city or county, which is not a bad idea. And you're probably gonna get more competitive rates as a city or county when negotiating fuel pricing. You can't roll a transit bus to a gas station. Although, let me tell you, we've been desperate for fuel. That has happened. Typically, it's very hard, especially if you have an awning, but it has happened. But it's usually it's not open for public consumption.
If we transition these fleets over, how much production do we need? Is it scaling accordingly? And how is it produced?
The innovative transit regulation, I worked on the regulation when I was back at CAR, but they actually have had the transits create their plan to get to zero emission for their fleets. It's good that they required it, but I will tell you, as I've seen transit discussions, it can get kind of complicated. The reason for that is mostly because when you're trying a new technology, you're usually not going to buy a fleet of 100. So you're probably going to go for between 1 to 5, 1 to 10 if you're feeling extra sassy. Maybe because we're in a different state of times, maybe 1 to 10 isn't as bad because it's been tried out in so many places. It's a tricky situation that you most likely want to talk to the vendors involved. If you're going to have a smaller fleet and you're trying things out, there are what we call mobile refuelers. And the mobile refuelers are a way to have impermanent infrastructure. So it's basically a station on wheels. You could lease it if you want to. You can own the bus for whatever amount of time. If you're using federal funds, then you're committed for 15 years. But you can do that as you're building a larger capacity station. Sizing that station is important depending on how many vehicles you bring into the fleet. And depending on how many depots you have, how much space you have, you may want multiple refuelers or refueling stations. That really comes down to the folks that are doing the planning in house. The transits have been good at being brothers and sisters to each other and sharing lessons learned. You will need to negotiate with different kinds of providers for who's going to design and build your fueling station, who's going to operate it. You typically will operate it, but sometimes you'll need support. Who's going to provide the fuel? Are you going to produce your own fuel? You could. You can produce hydrogen multiple ways. The US Hydrogen Alliance, we have a handout just on the 22 different ways that you can produce hydrogen. There's a lot of different blocks. It could be renewable or non. You can use natural gas or renewable natural gas to produce it. You could produce it on site that way. You could have CO2 emissions. You could not have CO2 emissions. You could have solid carbon emissions. You could produce it from water. You can produce it on site with water. I mean, AC Transit does produce some of their hydrogen. And, that's also possible. And I think they do it in two different pathways. I think the production one is only through electrolysis using water. They also have a natural gas fuel cell system that provides energy, not hydrogen. But there's many ways you can buy it from a hydrogen producer. And it can come from basically biogenic sources, water, fossil fuels. And then there's some other interesting ways like trash and aluminum. There's so many ways of producing hydrogen.
What message do you want to leave for people in the Bay Area in Northern California about hydrogen and policy? What
I think that for the Bay Area, all of us are composting, I hope. I think all of us do care. We have specific kinds of politics that we adhere to, but sometimes we see some extremism. in environmentalism that is a little counterproductive, unfortunately. And it's a lot heartbreaking to see that because sometimes when there is a push against anything that is not honestly like solar or a battery, actually impedes us from benefiting from emission reductions that we could have. And we're doing a lot more damage in the long run because there are emission reductions that we could have now. Sometimes if we're caught up in our perfectionism about what ought to be, we're not focused on what can happen today. Hydrogen is one of many solutions to displacing fossil fuels. I don't think enough people understand that everything they touch, see, consume, do has come from fossil fuel. When they want to replace it, they better understand that it's going to take a lot of resources, creativity, and probably more open mindedness than we're exercising. You
Yeah.
cannot throw solar panels and batteries absolutely everywhere. We do not have the footprint for that. But what we can do is couple all of the most amazing alternative energy pathways together to have a beautiful, diverse energy landscape that serves the world that we want to see.
And where do people find more about the USH and you if they're interested?
But you can find us on www.ushydrogenalliance.org. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find our organization on LinkedIn, and you can reach out to me at Roxana, Roxana, at ushydrogen.org.
You could tell she's not an elected official. They don't share their emails as frequent. Thank you, Roxana Bekemohammadi from the United States Hydrogen Alliance. Really appreciate you joining me today and educating us about hydrogen and where things are going. So thank you.
Thank you, Jared.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.